It's almost unlocking a new paradigm for people in Web3, like a new avenue to earn, like run a solver, because you can earn from filling these transactions.
And that's exactly where the open intents framework comes in. Because as a developer, I think it's important to be like, hey, like I want to get this up and running in like 5 minutes. And if it doesn't work in 5 minutes, I'm not going to work on it more.
Yeah. I mean, I feel very confident that intents are going to play a very major part in composability in the future.
From Alysia and Ellie Davidson, welcome to Composable, a podcast that takes you deep into the tech behind Web3's building blocks.
Every episode, we dive into one key question about how crypto works today and the design space for how it might look in the future.
Composable is an espresso pod, a production of Espresso Systems. All opinions expressed by Composable's hosts and podcast guests are solely their own views. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as investment, legal, or technical advice.
And with us, we have Eda from Hyperlane, who's here to talk about the Open Intents framework. We're very excited to hear about it because obviously intents are super popular at the moment. So Eda, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, for sure. It's never not scary when you're live. Hi everyone. My name is Eda, and I'm a developer advocate part of the Hyperlane team. And yes, as you mentioned briefly, we recently launched the Open Intents framework. It was actually like a very collaborative effort led by Hyperlane, Bootnode, and the Ethereum Foundation. So it's been great to see like how it's been received. And I'm happy to like deep dive into it. I guess like many people heard of it, but not really familiar with all the nuances. So yeah, excited to get to that today.
Yay, sounds good. Ellie always has some Twitter take. I'm so interested to hear what's the take on intent right now.
Yeah, so let me think about what's the Twitter take on intents. So I think 7683. Am I getting that ERC right? Anyway, Across
I think so.
Uniswaps. It's so hard to like keep these numbers track of. Anyway, so yeah, there is this intense ERC 7683 that's very popular right now. It was proposed by Across and Uniswap, and kind of its goal is to make a lot of these different intent protocols more composable with each other. You know, so kind of have a clean way to like define the information that you need. And so I think from what I understand of the open intents framework is like, you know, that's kind of taking it one step further and, you know, defining a lot of things so that we can really have composability between all of these different intent systems. But yeah, and I think on Twitter, I'm not so sure if a lot of people on Twitter are familiar with the open intents framework yet. But yeah, I know Josh Rudolph and Hyperlane, you know, talk about it quite a bit.
I think that's a great starting point, and maybe I can start by talking about like the ERC a bit, and then kind of segue into why, like, yeah, as you mentioned, like how the open intents framework kind of differs, like not differs, but like is different. Sometimes my English fails me. So exactly, as you mentioned, Ellie. So Across came out with their standardization. They built it together with Uniswap ERC 7638, or yes, which you just clicked before. And that standardizes a way to create intents. So that's like a standard, hey, like when you make intents, like make it this way, this is how the order book should look like, which is great when you standardize, you know, how things work. But the kind of key missing thing and what we try to do with the open intents framework is that, okay, now we have the standard here, but how can we make it easy for people to build with? Because if you still have the standard but not like ready to use code or ready to use like infrastructure, it's still kind of like introduces like a barrier of entry. There's still, you need to like create your own solver implementation, create all the infrastructure yourself, you know, go and make like have your chain added to the solver intent frameworks, etc. So that's kind of how the open intents framework came to be. Is like we have, you know, all these good ideas and how to build intents, like they're really efficient, effective, and we can get to that because I feel like intents is also kind of a buzzword, which is kind of, yeah, like many people say it, but not really like well defined, I guess. But once you have that ERC, I don't think that's sufficient to create adoption. You need to like build the framework. You need to like explain to people how like you can directly use it. You need to like have something that's set up easy to build like intent-based applications. And that's exactly where the open intents framework comes in. Because as a developer, I think it's important to be like, hey, like I want to get this up and running in like 5 minutes. And if it doesn't work in 5 minutes, I'm not going to work on it more. And that's kind of how the open intents framework came to be. And that was our goal, like at Hyperlane. What we try to do with like building open frameworks is that we want it easy for anyone to come in and take it and actually be like, oh, I actually have everything I need.
That's amazing. I think congratulations to everybody involved in this framework, because I think it's just showing a maturity of the ecosystem right now. Because at first, when you build in Web3, you don't even realize that there are things like standards. And then eventually you learn about standards like ERCs. And then you're like, okay, cool, I'm using this standard, but what should it connect to? How do I create a front end? How do I make it in such a way that it's actually user friendly? So I think this framework is something that I can see becoming a trend. Like not just the open intents framework, but the idea of creating frameworks around ERCs and all the other components in the stack. So I really like that. And I think before we talk about the components in the open intent framework stack, it'll be good to talk about what intents are for, who they're meant for. Why are we talking about intents? Why is it called an intent?
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Actually, on this point, I kind of want to add a bit more on the like making ERCs usable.
Yeah.
My entry to crypto, well, building like in crypto or Web3, was it like it was more buzzword then, was through Scaffold ETH, which was a tool which you can easily create like applications, like React-based applications, which have their backend and front end. And that's how I got to like easily understanding how this ERC, like it was, you know, it was just like an ERC20 creating your own token, or like ERC721 where like you create your own NFT. But it was so easy to like use this open tool where I have and quickly like spin up my own React app where I don't need to connect my backend. I have already the chains connected. And that's actually how I got to like meet Austin and all the people and kind of started my journey. So I'm like very a big fan of open frameworks, which make it easier for anyone to do that. And to answer your question on what is the open intents framework, but also just to go back to answer what is intents are a way that changes how transactions work. Well, not changes how they work, but they basically allow users to specify their goals instead of where you do today, or like in a regular transaction where you're like, hey, I want to swap my tokens on Uniswap for this rate, and this is, you know, I'm submitting this transaction with all the call data. So you have to specify all the details of your transaction when you're submitting. But when you think about it, most users or applications just kind of want to get to the end results. Like let's say you have some ETH, you want to get some USDC. So you don't really be like, hey, like this is the exact rate that I want to submit the transaction on Uniswap. So that is one way, like mostly how transactions work. And in the intents, when you want to use intents, is that you say, hey, like I have these ETH tokens, I want USDC. And I kind of want to like pay, this is the maximum I want to pay for my exchange rate. Can you just like, can the best actor possible do this instead of me like specifying all the details? So that is kind of how intents work and what they change. And you might be like, okay, like what does this mean actually for me? Well, this means that you don't, first of all, as an application, you might not be aware of the infrastructure underlying where you cannot like know the best path to get to the result you want to get to. Instead, you kind of offload that responsibility, that finality risk, that 7-day like settlement period onto these off-chain actors called solvers. And it just makes it easier for both users and applications to both build and to get like fast swaps. And I know like there's a really good presentation that Hart made at DevCon where he talks about like a 2-second time to like exchange as well. And that's kind of how intents allow you to get there, is that you have this 2-second like user experience so that people don't leave the screen without their transaction fulfilled.
Yeah, definitely. And they don't have to worry about which chain am I on? Am I bridging? Is the transaction going to succeed? And you said some terms there like settlement risk and finality time. So I know we'll get into that soon. Ellie, I'm curious, what is your definition of an intent?
No, I think that's a really great definition. I think my definition of an intent is literally just, an intent, like whatever the user wants to do. I do think a lot of the times on Twitter, intents usually are specifically referring to cross bridging or cross chain swaps, which they can be a lot more than that, but that's like right now the main use cases. I guess what's helpful for me is to like kind of walk through what happens when a user, let's say, bridges to another chain using intents. So the user says, okay, I want to go bridge to Arbitrum from Optimism. And they go to like Across's UI, they submit this, And like, how does this how does the user actually bridge in 2 seconds? Like, what is happening under the hood? So yeah, like Eda said, we have these solvers. Generally, the solvers tend to be a little bit more sophisticated. And what they do is they listen for a user's intent on the source chain, and then they front the user money on the destination chain. So if I want to bridge 10 ETH from Arbitrum to Optimism, the solver would say, I would lock my 10 ETH on Arbitrum, the source chain, and then the solver would give me their 10 ETH on Optimism. So that's kind of how it works. And then what settlement is that eventually the solver needs to go back to Arbitrum, the source chain, and get my 10 ETH that I locked up so that they're made whole. So that's kind of what's happening under the hood. And that's why it can be so fast, is because you're not actually bridging funds. Someone is just kind of giving you the funds on the other side, and they're assuming that they'll be able to get your funds on the source chain at some point in the future.
Yeah, I love that you brought on the steps, because it kind of underlines the point of an intent, is that it's not about the how, it's about the what. Like, what would you like to do? I would like to buy this asset. For some reason, this asset is not on the chain that I want, it's on another chain, and therefore I have to bridge. But as a user, you really don't care, and you don't even want to deal with the risks involved. So then you have these solvers who are able to do that on your behalf and then achieve those speeds that I mentioned, like 2 seconds even. And I think that is getting us closer to like just the typical everyday experiences that users today are used to. But I think us in Web3, we have a lot more tolerance for like all the steps involved, like the bridging, etc. But pretty soon, when we onboard like our parents and grandparents and cousins, you know, we definitely have to have better experiences.
Maybe a quick hot take. So it's kind of a meme on Twitter that intents are just equal to limit orders. And so what do you guys think? Are intents limit orders, or are they more than limit orders?
Let's see. I mean, I guess it is a limit order, right? Because you're asking someone to execute something, and they're probably only going to execute it at a time when it makes sense for them, whether it's profitable, because the solvers are competing. I think I like to think of solvers like middlemen. And I know middleman is normally like a bad term, because you think of a middleman as someone who is trying to extract value unfairly and making things more expensive for you. But in an intent network or an intent framework is a bit different, because you have a bunch of solvers competing. And because they're competing, they tend to give you the best transaction. So for example, if you use a cross protocol, the fees to do a cross-chain bridge is not that high. And you'd think it's high because there's some middleman charging you a fee, but because there's not just one solver and it's an entire network of solvers and they all want to benefit from this transaction, the fees kind of get, you know, to as low as it possibly can be. So yes, it's like a limit order, but I think it's actually just introducing an off-chain middleman, which is kind of controversial in my mind, but yeah.
No, I like that answer. What do you think, Eda?
So I kind of agree with that. I do think it's quite similar to how it works. Like, you specify like your maximum limit, you let like others kind of handle what you want to do. But I don't like, I think it's easy to make like comparisons and be like, hey, like this is very similar. It just creates like a mental model in your head. I'm sure there's like some nuances, but I think it's a fair like you can kind of say that, and I don't think it's a bad thing. It's just like easier to explain and just add like the extra features. To Alyssa's point on like the solvers, I think it is pretty cool, like to be like with the open intents framework, there is like an open source solver implementation, which I think makes it like accessible to a lot more people to like easily run, because otherwise it's quite hard to like make your own infrastructure and run it. But I think that's like actually a key component of the open intents framework, which might lead to having like an actual solver market where people can freely run their solvers instead of like it being more closed source.
That's a really good point. It's almost unlocking a new paradigm for people in Web3, like a new avenue to earn, like run a solver, because you can earn from benefiting from filling these transactions, regardless of what the protocol is. I don't know how easy it is to become a solver on a cross network, but potentially if an application is built using the OIF, then, it should be a bit easier. Is that what you're saying? It should be easier for like anyone to like run the software and be a solver in that network?
Yeah, I mean, you still do have to like run your own infrastructure, but
Right.
you actually have like the base open source implementation to do so. We'll see how practical it is and how many people actually do run it. Like it's still like a very new framework. So kind of, yeah, like I think with the framework, we try to build it and like see if they're like, what is the take on, you know, how the pieces are used. But it does provide you all the like actual code base to be able to do that.
Interesting. So I'm starting to think, just based on the discussion so far, that a good hackathon project would be to build a limit order DEX using the OIF, because I feel like that would work really well.
And then I think we can talk a bit about like the exact differences between intents and limit orders once that's there.
Yeah. So since we're here, we're talking about the various components. Let's just talk about it. Like, what are the components of the open intents framework?
Yeah, and I actually, so one other thing which I didn't mention about why we built the open intents framework, and I think it's actually important to mention, and I should have, like when I was talking it before, is, you know, like the intents concept is out there, like there's the ERC already. So you might be like, hey, okay, like why is there this framework? And it's fair that, you know, it's, as I mentioned, you know, it's easier when you have the code base, when you can actually go in and like run it up in a moment. But also like today, when you want to build intent-based applications, there are like some hurdles, like you have to run your own infrastructure or you have to partner with an intent-based protocol, which is great if you're like a chain like Base or Optimism and you have that resources to be able to go and like, hey, like can you prioritize my chain so that it's added and I can easily use this intents. But if you're like a smaller chain and, or, you know, you're just launching your new chain now, it's so easy to run your own roll up with like platforms like Caldera, where you're like, hey, I just spinned up my own, you know, Alysia chain. What do you do with that? Like you can't just go and like partner with an intent-based protocol. It might be lower priority. You might like need a lot of resources to do that. So not only do you only have like, you can either partner or you have to build your own infrastructure, which introduces too many barriers for entry. So what the open intents framework does is it kind of removes that friction over there, both in terms of you don't have to build your own infrastructure. You still have to run the solvers, as I said. But that's kind of actually another key point, which I didn't mention before, and I think it's important to kind of mention here now. And to answer your question, what components does the open intents framework consist of, is I like to describe as like three pieces. So there's first of all the smart contract piece. It does use a base ERC 7683. I'm glad that note was passing just when I was reading. It uses a base contract, which is the ERC 7683. So you can start with that. The second component is the open source solver implementation. And the third is the UI. So you actually have like an out of the box ready to use UI, which can get you started because, you know, like front end work is, you know, you might just want to be able to test quickly. Obviously, I see most people like migrating off the, you know, the base like UI to their owns. But that is basically like the three major components: the smart contract piece, the open source solver implementation, and then the UI.
Yeah, I really like that you guys package the UI with it, because I think that that's something that a lot of frameworks, they obviously don't do. And I know myself, like I'm not a front end dev, and so if I had to make a UI, that would be very difficult for me to do. So I think that that's actually like really great to just have it out of the box.
Yeah, and to mention, like it's very customizable. So I too do not like love UI work, but it kind of gives you like very easy access to be like, hey, like I kind of want to, you know, change the logo, change the, you know, descriptions, etc. So it makes it really. I don't want to be like, hey, these pieces are like set in stone and you can't change it, but they're basically like the modular building blocks where you can add on to your custom features and integrations, etc.
Yeah, I was literally just about to ask that if you could swap elements out. So is the UI component like I know the Hyperlane has like a UI for warp routes, maybe? I think you guys have like some boilerplate or template for that. Is it similar to that?
Yes, exactly. So I am just like also making sure to see if I can show it. I'm not sure if I can screen share, but it does use the Hyperlane Warp UI template. So it's pretty much similar. That's actually kind of why we built it. We saw that people were very easily using the Hyperlane Warp UI when they were deploying warp routes. And this was actually also my experience with scaffolding as well. We saw that people don't really want to build like a UI when they just want to get started. But it does have like the pre-built UI. If you go to that website, which is linked over there, you also see like a demo video built by Bootnode where they can access it. So you'll see that also in action.
All right, perfect. Maybe we can talk about, who do you think is the audience for the open intents framework? I know you talked about like new chains, but like which kind of devs do you think are the audience for it?
Yeah, that's a nice question. I do think like new chains launching who want to build intent-based applications are the best target audience. As we mentioned before, it's a pretty new framework which we launched. I think it's been 1 month, maybe like 1.5. I don't think it's been longer. So again, the target audience and the problem statement we started with was if you are a new chain, it's pretty hard to build intent-based applications because you don't have the resources or the infrastructure. So I think it's very like new app builders on like new chains, app builders who want to build like cross-chain apps. So not just on one chain, but want to build like on multiple chains. I think that's like a good target. I know that there's currently the Espresso hackathon running. So I'd be curious to see how many people build with that. I think it's ending today. So hopefully we'll see like who submit. I'm very excited to see the results over there. But generally, yeah, as you mentioned, it's people building on new chains, people who want to build cross-chain applications, I guess are the main target.
I've had a sneak peek at the hackathon submissions, and yeah, a lot of them use the open intents framework, and it's really cool what they have been able to build in a short amount of time.
I definitely want to see that. I haven't seen them yet.
Oh, that's amazing. I want you to explain a bit more about the problems. You mentioned that if you are a new chain, it's hard for you to set up intents. I don't really fully understand why. Could you explain that a bit more?
Yes, for sure. So one thing which, and so I don't want to, I think there's a great podcast with Hart and Nam, which was on the tokens, and like, I don't remember exactly, but I think that is also a great podcast to listen to. I'll try my best to explain, but just want to call out that I'm mostly like taking the conversation topics. So the reason we collectively built the open intents framework is that we've seen that intents are kind of becoming popular. It makes Ethereum feel like a single chain again, because you can like swap in a very short amount of time, like that 2 seconds, which we kind of mentioned before. But what we see is that building with intents are hard. The reason building with intents are hard is if you are a big chain, or like it's easier because you can partner with intent-based protocols. You can go to like Across and you can be like, hey, like I'm Optimism, I need to like have intent. So you can set up that, access the solver networks and kind of set up your chain and, all the applications on it easier. But if you're a smaller chain, you might not be top priority. So you either need to like invest a lot of resources. So you can't really like get intent-based applications without running your own infrastructure. So that includes like the solver networks, creating all the implementation, like how you will build out like the intent structure. Yeah, you can use like the standard, but if you're also your own chain, you can kind of come up with any kind of any kind of new mechanic you want. Well, I guess you would want to like access other chains, but you have the flexibility to do so. But yeah, like the core problem was because when you just launch, it's hard to like either partner or either set up your own infrastructure. And what you want is like, hey, like I built an app, but like no one's using my app, or like I can't even like set up intents. So that was kind of the two main issues that we saw like devs facing. And even though you have like the standards out there, having the standards, in my opinion, is not enough. You don't want to like create all the infrastructure which people are building, and everyone's kind of building in their own silos. What I think is cool with the open intents framework is that there's so many partners like building together like a core shared infrastructure. So you don't need to like, you can just opt in to like, you can go ahead and use it currently uses the Hyperlane ISM for a security module, but you can kind of switch it up. You can use like another you can use the Arbitrum intent engine if you want. Like you have the flexibility to kind of build like plug and play to these different modules. So you're just not like building in silos. But I'm not sure if that answers your question, but happy to dive deeper if it doesn't.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I can imagine if I were to create a chain today. So like you were saying, Alysia chain. Now how do I attract developers to build on this chain? Like they want to see user activity, they want to see volume. And again, if I'm a solver, how do I attract solvers to come and like fulfill for these intent protocols that these developers do build on the chain? Again, like they have to be incentivized. So I can imagine if there's a solver who already integrated with the Cross protocol and they know how to run that infrastructure and they have the liquidity to be able to front for these cross-chain transactions. If I want to get them on a Alysia chain, but then they have to learn how to run their solver for a new app on the Alysia chain, then that's going to be an issue. But if that app is built using the OIF framework, and then there are lots of apps built using that framework, then as a solver, it's easier. It's like you're the barrier of entry for them to then become a solver for your particular app, or for a developer to actually build an app using the ERC that you mentioned, as well as having a front end. So that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like, in some ways, it's like increasing composability of intent apps, just like how, you have standards like ERC20. It makes it so that any app that accepts tokens, once it's ERC20, it will accept your token once it's using that standard. So with this, it makes it so that if you are a solver and you've already integrated with another intent framework or intent-based app, you can easily integrate with another. So we're increasing composability for intent-based applications.
Exactly. So I think that's a great way to explain it. I think you nailed it on all the points. And it might be like, okay, why is this important as well? I think it's kind of clear that with the roll-up scaling roadmap, it's clear that there's so many chains launching. There's so much friction when you want to go from one chain to another that it's just not an okay user experience, and no one wants to face that. So unless we solve this, it's just not going to work out. Even if you have 5 big chains, they definitely need to talk to each other. And I think working with intents and the open intents framework is a very good solution to see where it goes.
Yeah, I'm very excited about this. People on Twitter often talk about the fact that there's so many infra projects and there's so many user experience pitfalls. And I can imagine that this is like a beautiful example of how you need both good frameworks and all standards like ERCs, and also having which is the next part of things, working together to then improve upon the UX problems. Because hopefully in the future, a user does not have to think about what is an intent. They're not even using a bridge. They don't know they're using a bridge, but they are, but they just are conducting a transaction.
Exactly. So like all the people, all the like projects working with the open intents framework, I think the goal is common, as you said, to extract the complexities of all this infrastructure and make it very easy for users to use and also developers to adapt.
Maybe if we can briefly go back to something we touched on in the beginning, is maybe we can kind of dive more into the risks that these solvers are taking, because I think that's very interesting. And that's where all of the interesting stuff happens, because there's a lot of different modules you can choose in the open intents framework, for example, like how you settle your intents, et cetera, that affect these risks differently. So yeah, I don't know if you want to give us a rundown of like what these, like how the solvers take on risk.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a quite important part, because that's kind of how the whole intent-based system works. And just to talk about what we mentioned by the solvers take on the risk, is that when you kind of submit an intent, when you submit a transaction, it's like you would actually like specify the details. But now with the intent-based system is that, hey, like you are just submitting a transaction and you're letting this off-chain specialized agent, the whole solver network, kind of compete to get your transaction and to submit it. So what this means is that they kind of take on you don't have to wait for settlement, which is optimism. You don't have to wait 7 days for your transaction to be finalized, but instead the solver is like, hey, like you can pay me the fee, I will take your transaction and I will actually take it. I will give you your tokens, and if there's a risk, I will be the one who is kind of slashed, or like who is affected by a reorg or something like that. So that's kind of what we mean by now the solver is like you offload that risk to this other off-chain agent who has more knowledge than you, so who can fulfill the request much faster. But also they are taking a fee. So this means that they are taking on a risk that in case there's a chain reorg, they will be affected by that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, and I think maybe it's useful, at least for me, to kind of walk through an example of how a reorg actually affects this, because I think sometimes it's a little unclear. So for example, let's say a user is bridging from Arbitrum to Optimism, just like we had before, and the user deposits their 10 ETH on Arbitrum. and then the solver fronts them 10 ETH on Optimism. But I think the question is, how does the solver know that the 10 ETH was actually deposited on Arbitrum? And this is where things get a little interesting, because a lot of solvers today, admittedly, will just listen to the rollups sequencer, and rollups will give a sequencer confirmation really quickly within like, less than a second, depending on what rollup it is. But here's what could happen. Here's what could go wrong. So the solver sees that the user locked funds on Arbitrum via the centralized sequencer, but this state is not finalized on Ethereum yet. So it's like, keep that in mind. And then it sends the user funds on Optimism. So it sends its 10 ETH. Now, what if Arbitrum reorgs and it reorgs out the block or the transaction that the user locked their funds in? Now the user has 10 ETH on Arbitrum and they have the solver's 10 ETH on Optimism, and the solver is now out 10 ETH. So this is kind of like how a reorg can affect solvers. And, this relates to a lot of what we do at Espresso, which is, you have different levels of confirmations to trust. You have the sequencer confirmations, which are very fast, but, they come with risk because sequencers can reorg, and they can sequencers can actually reorg without being malicious. Like a sequencer could reorg just because it crashed potentially, and then you kind of have other intermediary confirmations like an Espresso, and then you finally have like L1 finality. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of just like a walkthrough of the choices that solvers have to make, and what could go wrong, and like why the solvers are taking on this risk.
That's amazing. Thanks for coming through with that example. I hope people could visualize and follow everything in their mind, but I think you explained that so perfectly. I'm also curious, Eda, when you guys have been going through the process of creating this framework, have you been speaking to solvers and hearing their concerns as being a solver and participating in a solver network? And if so, can you share any of them?
That's a good question. So I'm actually, I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm guessing so. I wasn't like particularly involved in building out the framework. I kind of jumped in after I saw. I was like, oh my God, this is so cool. How can we kind of work on it more?
Yeah.
I'm assuming the answer is yes, but I kind of was just like thinking out loud. I'd be curious to hear if you guys have any ideas, especially like working on the hackathon with the Open Intents framework for a while. But I would think that definitely, because like there is the open source solver implementation built out by the teams.
Yeah.
However, I'm not sure about the mechanics or how kind of that came through.
Yeah. I think on my side, my knowledge of how solvers feel is a bit more on the theoretical side, like me just imagining, because if it is a competition, like the fact that you're essentially supplying liquidity, it's a bit different than a liquidity pool where you're subjected to however the liquidity pool is automated by whatever algorithm. But instead, you have an opportunity to decide which transactions you want to fulfill. So like if there's a transaction where the size is way too high, you're like, I'm not risking my funds on Optimism for you. I don't know what's going to happen if the sequence reorgs. I'm not they can decide not to. And I think that's great that they have that flexibility. But at the same time, they have to be super fast. And also they want to earn from the fees. So if they have to be super fast, then of course they would be willing to trust something like perhaps sequencer confirmations because it is quite fast, but maybe up to a limit because again, they don't want to risk too many funds in the event that there is a reorg and that is potentially affecting their fees. I'm assuming that the fees could be proportional to how much you transfer, but I'm actually not sure. But if that does impact how much you make, then of course you're trying to get as fast as possible whilst minimizing your risks. I think it's all well and good that we're making it easier for regular users to conduct these transactions and they don't have to think about everything, but we have to think about all the actors in the system. So we've thought about the devs, we created this framework, we were thinking about the users constantly, but also the guys who are supplying the liquidity, guys and gals, supplying liquidity, the solvers. Thinking about them is thinking about the risks that they're taking on and optimizing for being fast and secure so they can make as much money as possible. All of it has to work together. So that's how I view solvers. But honestly, I would love to speak to more solvers to actually hear from them, like what their issues are and what will make things better. But I don't have concrete evidence right now.
All right, maybe like we're kind of getting a little bit close to the end. So maybe a question is, so if the open Intense framework succeeds and becomes really popular, what do you think Intense will look like 2 years from now?
2 years is a very long time.
Yeah, it is.
So I think if the open intense framework successes and like succeeds and becomes like very popular, there will be all these like small building blocks which you can also change and add to it. Like for example, like the base security layer that it comes in with right now is the Hyperlane ISM, but you can have like multiple options, right? Like you don't need to opt into the default. Or the base contract is the base 7683, but maybe you have like another standard which you kind of want to opt into besides that as well. So if it becomes successful, I'd imagine that there's like multiple building blocks and you see much more apps using it, users not really caring, or like you like as a user, I don't think I need to know that it's like an intent or it just kind of fulfills my action. So I would see like more adoption of also cross-chain applications, and it just makes it like easier to build apps. And as a developer, you have like much more modular building blocks to kind of plug and play. And as a user, you just get like more apps which use the open intense framework in the backend, which means you kind of get like faster and better user experience. What do you like? I think this is like obviously my like guess for the future, but if you guys have any other ideas, or I'd be curious to hear as well.
Yeah. I mean, I feel very confident that intents are going to play a very major part in composability in the future. And I think that's a pretty popular opinion, but they really just offer something that gives users such a good experience. And it also gives solvers a very good experience as well, because they get to kind of choose what their liquidity is being used for, and they can be very granular in what they choose it's being used for. So yeah, I think intents are going to be very big. What I would hope in 2 years is that there are a lot of intent solver networks, and that they can be very competitive and really offer users very good prices. And also hope that these solver networks will share individual solvers, because if everybody follows the same standard, a solver can go from one network to another. And I think that's nice, because my hope is that we won't have an oligopoly of solver networks or a monopoly of solver networks, but we'll have a lot of decentralized solver networks. Anyway, Alysia, what do you think?
I think that's a great answer. I definitely agree with both of you. I think there's also a tension between solver networks and other methods for resolving cross-chain transactions. And I think 2 years from now, we'll be able to see who wins. I do think the solver network approach is very practical. It is in use today. And as a participant in that, you can choose how fast or slow you want to be. Whereas, for example, if you were to use ZK to resolve a cross-chain transaction, there are limitations that currently, we're facing. So I think that definitely, because of intents, we will be able to have a lot better user experiences for everyone involved, the solvers, the developers, and the end users.
One thing I do also want to call out is I think this is, well, to my knowledge, like one of the bigger, like most L2s or like different networks have come together to build like a framework together, which I don't think is very common in crypto overall. Like people build like their own pieces of infrastructure. So I think like this is kind of a nice way to unify Ethereum, although like it's not like a single chain. You can kind of have these open frameworks kind of working together. So hopefully it'll also be like an inspiration for other kind of contexts, not just like building intent-based applications, but like other contents, like seeing all like Espresso, Hyperlane, Arbitrum, Optimism, etc. come together to build like something together.
Oh, so beautifully said. And I totally agree with you. It's so refreshing to see all these protocols come together. Like when you see the list of protocols involved, you're like, really? All of these people are coming together to do this? What? So yeah, I love it.
All right. So I guess we can wrap up. What is a question that we can leave for the audience? Maybe the question is for the audience is that, if you're a dev out there, would you consider using the Open Intents framework to like quickly spin up a cross-chain app? If you're someone who was not considering making a cross-chain app, would this like change your mind and make you consider actually doing something cross-chain because it's very easy? I'd be curious to hear what devs think.
Amazing. Eda, do you want to plug anything? Plug yourself, plug Hyperlane.
So we have a blog on the Open Intents framework and how you can start building on it. It's on the Hyperlane Medium. I think that's like a good place to get started, to learn more about how the framework works and how you can like get more details. I also want to call out to the workshops we did at the Brew and Build hackathon. I gave like a short introduction to the Open Intents framework, and then Bootnode, who's also like one of the core developers, had like a walkthrough on how you can build with the Open Intents framework. So I think that's like a great resource for anyone who is interested.
Yeah, we'll be sure we can link those in the show notes for anybody who's interested.
Hey, this is Ellie and Alysia. Thank you for joining us on another episode of Composable. We love hearing from you, so please hit us up on Twitter at ComposablePod, send us feedback, and join the conversation.
Our episodes go live every 2 weeks at 7 a.m. Eastern Time, so make sure you like and subscribe so you never miss an update, and you can even enjoy it with your morning coffee. Share it with your friends and fellow builders.
We'll see you next time on Composable.